The morning at the Louisiana State Court began like any other day. Inside the courtroom, familiar sounds echoed: the rustling of papers, the soft thud of shoes on the wooden floor, and occasionally, the gavel striking from a neighboring chamber. Judge Sandra sat solemnly on the bench. At 48, she was known for her composure and firmness, never allowing emotions to interfere with her work. Her hands rested neatly on the polished oak table, her eyes sweeping over the list of the day's cases. And there was nothing out of the ordinary. State of Louisiana versus Daniel Thompson. The bailiff's voice rang out. Sandra gave a slight nod, eyes still fixed on the case file. Proceed. The courtroom door opened. And in that moment, Sandra's world tilted. Daniel was the man being led in, hands cuffed, eyes cast down to the floor. Daniel, the boy who once lay with her beneath the magnolia tree, dreaming of a world without prejudice. The little boy who once held her hand as they ran through the red dirt roads of Hammond, laughing freely under the summer sun. Her dearest childhood friend now stood before her as a defendant. Sandra's hand trembled slightly. She looked directly at the man in front of her. Thin, graying hair, quiet eyes. But something still lingered there, something that made her chest tighten. Familiarity. Daniel looked up too. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Recognition. Then he looked down quietly, as if it had never happened. The entire room seemed to freeze. The lawyers, clerks, court staff. None noticed what was happening between the judge and the accused. But inside Sandra, a storm of memories was surging. She gripped the gavel tightly. Mr. Daniel Thompson, you are charged with assault, robbery, and resisting law enforcement. How do you plead? Daniel looked up, his voice hoarse, but clear. Not guilty, Your Honor. Sandra took a deep breath. She had to steady her heartbeat, had to push everything out of her mind. This was her job, a trial, a defendant, but somehow her whole body trembled slightly. She nodded. Proceed with the trial. Beneath the powerful black robe, a woman was struggling to stay upright. In front of her was a man who was not just a defendant, but her past, her pain, her unanswered question. And this was no longer an ordinary trial. It was a fated confrontation. Sandra rushed back to her private chambers during the recess. As the door closed behind her, she leaned against the wall, her heart still pounding. She had never allowed herself to be overcome by emotion, but this time was different. No one knew that the man sitting beneath the judge's bench had once been an inseparable part of her childhood. Daniel Thompson. That name still echoed in her mind, as if it had never been touched by time. They first met at the age of 9, beside a small stream behind the town of Hammond. Sandra had snuck away from a family gathering, seeking a bit of quiet while Daniel was struggling to untangle his fishing line, which was caught in a tree branch. The curly-haired girl in a white dress had knelt beside the black boy, lips pressed in concentration as he tugged on the line. Want some help? That innocent question marked the start of a friendship that lasted for years, weathering judgmental stares, gossiping whispers, and the invisible line that split the white and black communities in their town. They explored every corner of Hammond together, climbing the old magnolia tree, sneaking swims in the forbidden lake, and lying side by side counting stars on summer nights. Foolish promises were made, with the kind of conviction only childhood could believe in. No matter what happens, we'll never turn our backs on each other, right? Daniel had once asked, his eyes unusually serious. Yes, never, Sandra had replied. But the summer they turned 14, everything fell apart. One afternoon, her father, a rigid conservative man who would never tolerate a black boy on his doorstep, caught them sitting on the front porch steps, barely a foot apart, laughing over some silly story. Inside, now. His voice was ice. He didn't need to yell. Daniel jumped up and stepped back. Sandra turned to him, trying to say something, but Daniel gently shook his head. "It's okay. I understand." Then he turned and walked away, and Sandra didn't stop him. The next day, Daniel's family moved away. No goodbye, no letter, no trace. Sandra threw herself into academics, using knowledge to cover the nameless guilt she had carried. She went to college, then law school, and eventually became a judge, a keeper of justice. But today, the name Daniel Thompson had shaken the ideals she once thought unshakable. On her desk was Daniel's file, a string of minor offenses, petty theft, disorderly conduct, loitering. Nothing severe, but nothing easy either. Sandra flipped through the pages, her heart tightening. The cold sentences handed down by judges like herself, the red stamps like wounds that had never healed on the record of a man. If I had called out to him that day. The thought echoed in her mind, heard by no one. A knock at the door startled her. Her assistant, Margaret, entered cautiously. "Judge, are you all right? You seem unsettled." Sandra offered a faint smile. "I'm just thinking. It's a complicated case." But in her heart, it was no longer just a case. It was her judgment, a promise made long ago, unfulfilled. And now, she had to face it, on the judge's bench, before the public eye, under the harsh lights and the gaze of those awaiting a verdict. The trial resumed after the lunch break. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had grown heavier. Reporters had started to flood in, and the murmurs throughout the room buzzed like static before a storm. Judge Sandra Hayes entered the room, her face stern, though her eyes still carried traces of turmoil. She would never allow herself to show it, but sometimes restraint reveals the most. Daniel kept his head bowed at the defendant's table, hands clasped tightly together, as if trying to hold on to what little remained. Though handcuffed, he carried a strange air of calm, not resignation, but a quiet understanding of how unfair the game had become. At the prosecution table, Prosecutor Powell raised his voice firmly. "Your Honor, today we would like to present the surveillance footage from the convenience store where the incident allegedly took place." The projector flickered on, casting a dim blue light across the courtroom's old wooden panels. The footage appeared, a man in a red hoodie walking into the store. The camera, mounted in a high corner, was grainy, almost nothing but shifting gray blobs. The figure approached the counter, appeared to argue with the clerk, then lunged across the counter, an action that resembled robbery. But the face was unrecognizable. No defining features, only a vague outline and a red hoodie. Sandra watched intently, trying to peer through the static, to find the truth. Was this Daniel? Or was it just a shadow the system had pinned guilt upon? Then came defense attorney Lisa Porter's rebuttal, a young but fierce woman who approached the bench with clarity and strength. "Your Honor, as seen in the footage, there is no clear identification. We cannot see the defendant's face, no biometric evidence was found, and no direct physical evidence ties him to the scene." She turned to the jury. "We cannot allow a man to lose his freedom because of a red hoodie and proximity to a crime scene." Next came the store clerk's testimony, the prosecution's key witness. He testified, "The guy came in, seemed drunk or really agitated. He yelled, then shoved me and jumped over the counter. I saw he was wearing red." Lisa approached, pressing him. "Did you see the man's face clearly?" "No. I only saw that he had dark skin and a red hoodie." "So it could have been anyone in the area, correct?" "It could have." Doubt began to ripple visibly. The jurors exchanged glances. Sandra silently observed, unable to intervene, though a bell seemed to ring endlessly inside her. Lisa pressed on. "The defendant was arrested while walking 3 blocks from the scene. No weapon, no stolen goods, and no one who could definitively identify him as the man in the footage. All we have is a presumption." The prosecution countered weakly. He had cash in his pocket, almost the same amount that was missing. There's no way to prove that money came from the store. No dye, no marked bills, no forensic link, Lisa replied. During a brief recess, Sandra sat quietly behind the bench. She looked at Daniel. He still didn't look back. But in that moment, a question echoed inside her. If this were any other man, not Daniel, would I be watching this closely? Would I be questioning the system itself? It wasn't just Daniel on trial. It was her faith in justice. The next morning, the court resumed under a heavy atmosphere. The spectator benches were fully packed. News of the trial spread quickly, and all eyes were fixed on one woman, seated high on the bench, Judge Sandra Hayes. With her elegant silver hair and resolute eyes, Sandra embodied the law, but only she knew. Today, the law was testing her heart. Defense attorney Lisa called the next witness, Officer Daniel Harris, who had personally arrested the defendant. A burly man with a ruddy face stepped up to the witness stand. His police uniform collar strained against his thick neck. His voice was deep and cold. Lisa approached. Officer Harris, you were the one who arrested the defendant, Daniel, correct? Yes. Where was he arrested? 2 blocks east of the store. What was he doing at the time? Walking, didn't say much, looked a little sullen. Any weapons? No. Any stolen goods? A bit of cash. Was there any evidence that the money came from the store? No. The room fell silent. Lisa tilted her head. Officer Harris, did you see him wearing a red hoodie? He was wearing a black jacket. Did anyone search the area for a red hoodie? There was no extended search warrant, so no. So you arrested a man with no weapon, no physical evidence, not wearing the described clothing, just because he looked like the suspect? Were you able to positively identify the face of the person in the video? Officer Harris pressed his lips together. No. A murmur rippled from the press gallery. The jury began to shift in their seats. Sandra quietly observed, her hand tightening around the gavel as if trying to hold on to one last anchor. Lisa looked up at her. Your Honor, I am not questioning the police. I am questioning the way we allow suspicion to become conviction. Since when is a black man walking near a crime scene enough to be considered a criminal? Sandra swallowed hard. Those words pierced straight into memories she had long buried. The dusty red roads of Hammond, Daniel's family's run-down pickup truck, his final words before they parted ways. You'll forget me one day, because I was never allowed where you were going. Sandra had spent her entire life ensuring that personal emotions did not sway justice. But in this moment, she was forced to face a truth. Sometimes, emotion allows us to see what the law has overlooked. The prosecution countered by presenting the testimony of an anonymous witness through case files, someone who had allegedly seen Daniel near the scene acting suspiciously. No direct testimony, no appearance in court. Lisa reacted sharply. Your Honor, this is not a crime show. This is a human life, and a suspicious vibe is not evidence. The courtroom shook. Sandra did not respond immediately. She looked into Daniel's eyes, still silent, still enduring. She began to understand. Justice is not just about balancing black and white. Sometimes, it's about having the courage to acknowledge the gray. As the trial adjourned for a break, the atmosphere outside the courtroom remained tense, like a stretched string. Reporters snapped photos nonstop, while court staff whispered about the strange case, where the judge seemed to change the expression every time she looked at the defendant. Back in her office, Judge Sandra sat silently by the window. On her desk lay the case file, fragmented data, incomplete evidence, conflicting testimonies. Beside it, she had another file, not from the court, not stamped, just her memories. She pulled out an old photo, slightly blurred with time. 2 children riding bicycles under a sunset, a white girl with braids hanging down her back, a black boy with a bright smile. Daniel, the boy who once told her, "One day, you're going to do something great. I know it. But never forget where you started." Sandra had never truly forgotten. She had only learned to bury it deep beneath the cold laws and rulings. That afternoon, Lisa called a new witness, a forensic image analyst. He presented to the jury. "I analyzed the store's surveillance video. Though the quality is poor, I can determine that the height and build of the person in the footage is approximately 10 centimeters shorter than the defendant. Also, the person in the video has a slight limp, whereas the defendant shows no such sign." A decisive blow to the prosecution's case. Prosecutor Powell quickly attempted to rebut, claiming the video's timestamp was inaccurate, but the expert countered. The original footage shows 8:12 p.m., but the metadata in the video logs 8:45. There's evidence of time tampering. A ripple of shock spread throughout the courtroom. Sandra looked toward Daniel. He still hung his head, but this time there was no longer resignation, only flickering hope. Then came the crucial moment. Daniel chose to testify on his behalf. The courtroom held its breath. He stepped forward, shackles clinking softly with each slow step. Under the cold lighting, his voice was low but clear. "I've made mistakes in my life. I've been arrested for petty things, but I didn't rob any store. That night, I was on my way to a friend's house, someone who's too scared to testify, because in the place I live, telling the truth can get you killed." Daniel took a deep breath, eyes reddening. "I'm not begging for mercy. I'm only asking to be heard, as a human being, not a sentence already written." Silence filled the courtroom. Sandra's hand had clenched so tightly, it had turned pale. Every word he spoke felt like a blade reopening her heart, and she realized this wasn't just a trial of one man. It was a summons for the conscience of the entire system. She closed the case file, and for the first time during the entire trial, her eyes looked directly at Daniel. Not with the gaze of a judge, but with the eyes of someone who had once abandoned the past, and now was being forced to face it. That evening, the court adjourned, but Judge Sandra did not leave her chambers. She sat alone in the quiet room, the warm yellow light casting a soft glow on the judge's robe hanging behind her. Stacks of files were neatly sorted on the desk, but one folder lay apart, the disciplinary file of Officer Daniel Harris, who arrested Daniel. Sandra opened each page. No physical evidence, no red hoodie, no search of the scene, all based on intuition. A storm churned inside her. As a judge, Sandra had always believed in principles and due process, but seeing Daniel escorted in and out of court like an animal, branded guilty before uttering a word, she realized that the system she had upheld had fatal cracks. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The city had heard of Judge Sandra and her childhood friend. Sandra stepped up to the bench. Her gaze was cold as steel, but her voice was unexpectedly calm. "Before we move into the closing arguments, I want to remind everyone. This trial is not about judging a man's past, but about finding the truth of one fateful night." Prosecutor Richard Powell presented his closing argument, focusing on Daniel's criminal record and proximity to the crime scene. But defense attorney Lisa stood, eyes unwavering. If being black, having a prior record, and walking near a crime scene are enough to convict someone, then which of us can say with certainty that we won't be defendants one day? She looked directly at the jury. Blurry video. No red hoodie. No credible witness. Everything is speculation, not truth. Then, it was Sandra's turn. The courtroom fell utterly silent. She stood, slowly but firmly. "I've sat on this bench for decades. Criminals smile behind the defendant's stand, and innocent people weep in prison. But I've never forgotten this. Each trial is a chance to correct society's wrongs." "James, no. Daniel Anderson is the man on trial today. But really, what's being judged is our own bias. Sandra looked to the jury, her eyes resolute. Please, do not convict someone just because they've been convicted before. When she struck the gavel to adjourn court for jury deliberation, someone in the courtroom whispered, "She's not just a judge. She's fighting for real justice." Sandra gave no reply, only a slight nod. In her heart, the darkness within the justice system hadn't fully lifted, but a sliver of light had begun to pierce through. The courtroom was silent, as if someone had sucked all the air out of it. Daniel sat motionless, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the worn wooden floor beneath him. Attorney Lisa stood close by, occasionally resting her hand on her client's shoulder, as if trying to transmit resilience. Judge Sandra remained seated high on the bench, her eyes fixed on the door where the jury had disappeared hours earlier. Time passed, with a cruel slowness. Then suddenly, that door opened. The jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman, her hands trembling, stepped forward, carrying a white envelope. Sandra nodded and took the paper, her eyes quickly scanning the lines. She set the envelope down. Her voice rang out, clear, steady, but laced with an emotion too complex to name. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus Daniel Anderson, the jury has reached a unanimous verdict. Every heart in the room seemed suspended in the air. Not guilty. Silence. A pause, stretched, breathless. Then, as if a dam had broken, the first sounds erupted. A sigh of relief, muffled sobs, and scattered applause, tentative yet full of emotion. Daniel did not smile. He did not cry. He exhaled, deeply, as though after years of suffocating under pressure, he could finally take his first full breath. Sandra struck the gavel, her eyes still locked on Daniel. The court acknowledges the verdict. Daniel Anderson, you are declared not guilty. Your freedom is restored. Daniel turned to look at Sandra, for the first time since the trial had begun. Their eyes met, no longer as defendant and judge, but as two children who had once sat beneath a magnolia tree, now grown and scarred by unnamed wounds. Later, as the room slowly emptied, Daniel walked toward the bench. He stopped a few steps away from Sandra, his voice low and hoarse, but filled with emotion. I've been wondering, these past days, why you didn't say anything, why you didn't acknowledge me. Sandra didn't look away. She answered truthfully, because if I spoke, everything could have collapsed. I couldn't let personal feelings tilt the scales of justice. I had to choose silence, so I could keep the promise we made long ago, to protect you through true fairness. Daniel pressed his lips together, silent. I don't know whether to thank you or be angry, he said, then gave a slight nod. But at least this time, I was heard. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, this time not in handcuffs, but with his dignity restored. Sandra remained seated alone, her hand gently gripping the gavel. A case had concluded, but she knew a new battle had just begun. That night, the courthouse lights had gone out. The long corridors echoed only with the footsteps of the cleaning staff. Sandra sat alone in her office, the desk lamp casting a warm golden glow over scattered notes. She hadn't gone home. She couldn't. The evening news replayed the moment of her verdict, then cut to a shot of Daniel being embraced by loved ones outside the courthouse. His face was still stunned, as if he couldn't believe he was truly free. Just then, the desk phone rang. No number was displayed. Sandra picked up. Sandra Hayes? A deep, cold male voice rang out. Who is this? She asked. Someone who used to trust you, and now is disappointed. Sandra tightened her grip on the receiver, voice calm. I have nothing to say to those who hide behind anonymity. Then just listen. Your actions today attracted attention. There are people in very high places who don't like this kind of sentimentality. Daniel Anderson was never meant to be released. The court ruled based on procedure and the law. Sandra said, a soft laugh from the other end. The law is a tool, not the truth, and you just used it improperly. You may need a reminder. A judge's seat is not immortal. Click, click, click. The call disconnected. Sandra set the receiver down, but her hand was still trembling, not from fear, but from anger. The next day, an anonymous article appeared on a local media outlet. Judge has personal ties to defendant. Was the verdict truly fair? No evidence, no citations, but enough to ignite public opinion and awaken shadowy forces. The Chief Justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court called. The Judicial Committee launched an internal investigation. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Sandra was asked to step back from several pending cases. That afternoon, in her office, her assistant Margaret entered, holding a stack of mail. They keep coming. Some are protest letters, but this one you might want to see. Sandra opened it, a handwritten letter. The script is slanted and slightly shaky. I'm the mother of a young man who was wrongfully arrested by police 5 years ago. No one believed him. No one gave him a chance like you gave Daniel. He committed suicide in jail. I haven't written anything in 5 years, but today I want to say thank you. Thank you for standing in the storm. Thank you for not turning your back. Sandra sat still. No one had clapped in the courtroom that day, but now she began to understand the meaning of silence and having a voice. That evening, Sandra stepped out of the courthouse building and saw Daniel standing alone by the fence outside the gate. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Only a nod, a glance. No words, yet enough to know. Today, justice has taken one step further out of the dark. The next morning, a thick envelope was left in front of Sandra's office door. No sender, no seal. Inside was a set of internal documents, handwritten notes, printed emails, copies of complaints, all related to cases that had been buried. 12 complaints about police misconduct over the past 5 years. All were dismissed. All bore the same signature, Judge Roy Beckett, Sandra's predecessor. At that exact moment, Margaret walked in, pale-faced. You won't believe this. The local papers published it, that you were close to defendant Daniel Anderson in your youth. They want to reopen the case. Sandra sighed. They don't want justice. They just want an excuse. An emergency hearing was held that afternoon at the State Judicial Council. Chairing it, Chief Justice Malcolm Frey, a white man in his 70s with short silver hair and eyes cold as steel. Sandra walked in without her judge's robe, without any badge of office, just a file in hand. Malcolm began. Judge Hayes, you are causing severe division. The media is in chaos. The public is questioning the courts. Do you have anything to say? Sandra stood up and looked straight at him. I didn't come here to apologize. The room stirred. I came to ask, why were all 12 complaints about police brutality dismissed? And why is the name on each of them Judge Beckett's, the man now enjoying a quiet retirement in Florida, while people like Daniel sit in prison for life? Malcolm frowned. That's not what we're here to discuss. Sandra placed the file on the table in front of him. Number this is exactly what we need to discuss, because if we don't, we're no longer keepers of justice. We're just wardens of a prison. A female member of the council, Judge Rosa Medina, glanced through the file, then looked up at Sandra. Do you have evidence that this system deliberately covered up misconduct? Sandra nodded. I do, and I will release it to the public, unless the council immediately launches an independent investigation. Malcolm slammed his hand on the table. Are you threatening us? Sandra remained calm. No, I'm making a choice between keeping my seat and keeping my conscience. That very evening, Sandra held a public press conference on the steps of the district courthouse. Crowds gathered, cameras broadcast live. People pushed to get closer, and among them stood Daniel, visibly emotional. Sandra used no script, no prepared speech. She spoke only with truth. I used to believe justice was absolute and the law was always right, but I was wrong. The law isn't wrong. The people who operate it have turned it into a tool for self-interest. I cannot stay silent knowing how many verdicts are built on unclear records, coerced statements, and the silence of us, those who sit in the highest seats. Today I call for a statewide investigation into all cases involving police officers with a history of violent behavior. I urge judges, lawyers, citizens to rise, not to oppose the law, but to save its soul. Applause erupted across the courthouse steps. Some people cried. The crowd began chanting, "Justice for all! Justice for all!" Sandra stood there, her face unhidden, showing fatigue, but her eyes burning bright. That night, she received an email. Subject: "We're ready." Sent from a group of former judges, prosecutors, and investigative journalists, people once cast aside for daring to speak up. Attached is a final line. "If you dare to strike the match, we'll keep the flame burning." It was a Monday morning. A light rain was falling. The wind brushed across the windows of Judge Sandra's office, like the weary sighs of the city. On her desk sat the letter of resignation, missing only a signature. Margaret, her loyal assistant, walked in, carrying a cup of hot coffee. "Someone from the governor's office called. They want you to speak at the announcement of the new Judicial Reform Commission. They want you to lead it." Sandra looked up, eyes red but shining. "I haven't submitted my resignation yet." Margaret smiled. "Then maybe today's the day." That afternoon, Sandra entered the courtroom for the last time as a judge. A small case, land dispute, no cameras, no press, just regular citizens waiting for a fair ruling. When the session ended, she remained seated instead of standing up to leave as usual. Everyone looked around in confusion. Then she spoke. "Before I leave this bench, I have something to say. Being a judge is an honor, but also an oath. Not an oath of loyalty to the system, but to justice. I once believed justice lived in clauses, statutes, and precedents, but after Daniel Anderson's case, I've come to understand. True justice lives in the heart of the one who dares to ask, is this right? Today is the last day I sit in this chair, but it's not the last day I fight for justice. I step down, so I can stand up somewhere else." A sacred silence filled the courtroom. No applause, no chants, just eyes, looking at her as a judge and someone who lit a fire. A few weeks later at the Louisiana State Capitol, the official announcement of the State Judicial Reform Commission was held. Sandra wore a dark gray suit, no longer the judge's robe, no longer the symbol of the court, but a new symbol of change. She stepped up to the podium, holding the mic, speaking in a calm and steady voice. "I'm not standing here to say our judicial system has collapsed. I'm standing here to admit it has been cracked for a long time. But just like any structure that's broken, it can be rebuilt." A few months later, at a public high school in Hammond, Sandra's hometown, a special talk was held. Guest speaker, Sandra Hayes. A girl in the front row, dark-skinned with curly hair, eyes sharp as a blade, raised her hand. "Do you regret it, choosing this path?" Sandra smiled. "Yes, I regret not doing it sooner." The girl nodded, and then, without a word, no spectacle, she stood up. All the other students followed, not to leave the room, but to show they had heard, they understood, and were ready to stand with her. That evening, Sandra sat on her porch, watching the sunset quietly cast gold over the rooftops and the old magnolia tree out front. Beside her sat Daniel Anderson, once the man at the defendant's stand, now beside her like an old friend. Daniel said softly, "I used to think this world had no place for people like us." Sandra replied, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. We don't wait for them to invite us in. We open the door, and once we're in, we don't let it close again. Final message. Justice isn't something we wear. It's something we must carry in our hearts. Every day, every verdict, every time we rise. Sandra Hayes.